just so you know.
Okay, great. Okay, now can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, and just you can send Arabella a message if there's any technical issues that occur during this, and we will see if we can do it smoothly. So I've called this Tantra Through the Ages because one of my interests is history and archaeology, as Arabella mentioned. So I'm bringing that lens to bear on this very fascinating, complex, daunting question of what is Tantra? And this is a topic that for those of you who are studying Tantra and teaching Tantra, it comes up again and again, I'm sure. People say, well, what is Tantra? You know, it's sacred sex, right? Or, you know, I've gotten a million different answers to the question of what is Tantra from people that I've talked to or have taught or been a student of. So I'm going to give this presentation a little bit of a linear mental lens that I hope will provide a way to bring up some issues that then we can talk about. So let's plunge in. What is Tantra? And this is my own definition after going through lots of interviews and talks and reading and what have you. Tantra is a bewildering array of texts and traditions that span thousands of years, thousands of square miles, at least a dozen cultures, and at least 3 ancient systems of belief. So this gives you a sense of the daunting part that I mentioned. There is no right or easy definition of what is Tantra. And Swamiji, who's here, can talk to you a little bit in way more depth than I can about the particular lineage that he has brought to me and to so many others. But I'm going to kind of step back and provide a broader and more general brush that then I'm hoping that that he might be able to focus some questions on. Okay. Now this is from Pandit Rajmani, who is at the Himalayan Institute, again, part of the lineage that many of you are involved with Swami Rama's teaching. And this was a wonderful quote that really caught me when I was trying to figure out what Tantra was. And I'll read it. I know you can read it on the screen, but it helps to, I think, embody it, to speak it. And he said that it is said that it would take even a true adept 1,000 lifetimes to practice all the tantric disciplines. The texts are written in Sanskrit, with the exception of approximately 1,000 texts in Pali, Prakrita, Tibetan, Hindi, and Bengali. So some of those languages you probably have not heard of. And that's because we're talking about India. We're talking about a very, very complex ancient culture that is not simply the Indian culture, but is one of the world's most creative and ancient traditions. And I just strewn some of the examples of the documents that are related to Tantra that one can find that span a number of millennia. So,
Andrew, what's that one in the corner, in the lower right corner?
That's a good question. I don't have the caption in front of me. I just thought it was beautiful. And I had it in my files, but I didn't actually pull the caption up. Can anybody read it?
It looks like a star chart.
I think it's astronomical, but I don't know for sure. And we'll actually mention astronomy later on.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Okay, so geography. This is important. So where did this all begin? And this is the satellite image of the Indian subcontinent. You can see the Gangetic Plain, or the Ganges Plain, that runs just south of the Himalayas up there on kind of the top right. And Sri Lanka, the island down below, just off India. To your right, you've got Southeast Asia, which starts with Bangladesh and moves into Burma and Laos and Vietnam and Thailand. And then to your left, you've got that drier area, the top left, which is the Persian or Iranian plateau. So that's Afghanistan, Persia. And then as you go further to the west, you see Iraq, and then off in the corner there is a little bit of Saudi Arabia. So this gives you, this is important to give a sense of where Tantra began and how it spread and how it eventually got to us. So let's start with the Indus civilization. Now, you all have heard of Mesopotamia and Egypt, I'm sure, the two great early civilizations, but lesser known is this third civilization, which flourished at about the same time as those better known civilizations. And when I say civilization, what I mean is this is the first time that humans came together in large numbers to form cities that were based on farming, agriculture, and trade. And it was a time when writing first appeared on the planet. So the Mesopotamians, of course, had cuneiform. The Egyptians had hieroglyphics. The Indus had their own system of writing. We have not yet deciphered it. There's a lot of controversy over how to read the few things we have from the Indus, but it's really important to know that these people actually were literate. And this image below is of a place I did some stories about. It's called Mohenjo-Daro. It was a fantastically enormous city, as big as anything you would find in the ancient world, in Egypt or Mesopotamia. And to your left there is what they believe was a ritual bath, it's called the Great Bath. And then to your right, up in the top, is this strange kind of circular structure. Now, one of the odd things about the Indus civilization is that it didn't have pyramids or ziggurats, these monumental structures, as well as temples that were common in Egypt and Mesopotamia. So one of the peculiar things about the Indus, which was located, by the way, you'll see the map there in what is now Northwest India as well as Pakistan. One of the strange things about this society was that they didn't seem to create large structures that people came together to worship in. And for that matter, they don't seem to be large palaces where kings live, which is very common in other parts of the world, including China. Now, this may be true, but that little structure on the right at the top there in the picture at the bottom was long believed to be a Buddhist stupa that was built later, much later, after the city was destroyed and abandoned. Then the Buddhists arrived and built that structure. But now there's actually, in the past 10 years, there's been some speculation that this actually might be from the period of the Indus and might be the only example of a monumental structure, possibly a temple that was built. But for the most part, the Indus people did not seem to require a large indoor space in which to worship. Let's see, is there anything else? Any questions about that and timing and where this place is and what it's all about?
I'm curious, could that have been a reservoir, a water reservoir?
It's possible, although it's not plastered, which would be the typical way. Like the bath you see to your left, that would have been plastered so that the water could be held. Mm-hmm. So probably not, but again, it's very hard to say. Now, just to mention how the Indus civilization came to its end, it gradually developed, and then around 1900 BC, which would be, let's say, about the time that the first kingdom in Egypt collapsed, and in Mesopotamia there was also a collapse there. The Indus civilization kind of it didn't collapse because of invasion or anything else like massive climate change that archaeologists have been able to determine. Instead, it seems that people gradually began to drift away from the cities. Now, we don't know why. Was it because cities no longer were fashionable? Was there a breakdown in trade? It's really unclear, but gradually people moved back to their villages, and these large cities, there are maybe a half dozen to a dozen of these large Indus cities, they simply were abandoned, not destroyed. And people moved out back into the countryside to live a simpler rural lifestyle. And that's important as we move into discussing the specifics of Tantra. Now, here are some of the seals. These are impressions. They're reverse images that you can press them in clay and you can stamp something with it. Stamp seals is another term for these. And these are fascinating because these two seals, which date to around 2000 BC, so right at the end of the Indus civilization, they seem to show images that are familiar, or at least relate to what comes later in the Indian subcontinent. On the left, you'll see this yogic figure, which some scholars believe might be an example of Rudra, or a kind of proto-Shiva, or a lord of animals. Rudra and Shiva and were both associated with the lord of animals. So this could be an example. And up there above the head, you can see some of the Indus script that I mentioned, which is yet to be deciphered. So what's interesting is that this figure is in what might be called a yogic posture, and both on the left and the right. And the one on the left, there's the heels pointing down, is a specific asana, which is a very difficult asana, which has been practiced for a long time. However, because we can't read this writing, we really have no idea. We can't even tell what gender these images are, whether they're hermaphroditic, are they masculine and feminine? It seems unclear, and there's been whole articles written about the tiny little incisions that you see, which might provide hints as to gender. But we really don't know. That's the answer. Without clearly understanding what they're writing, a lot of what we see on these images is pure speculation. And you have to remember too, we're looking at these through the lens of the history that followed. So you might say, well, it's obviously an asana, it's obviously a yogic posture. Well, maybe, maybe not. They might have used these postures in a very, very different way. So again, it's very hazy, but it does provide us with a hint at what led to the beginnings of the Indian traditions, which evolved into what we call Tantra. The other thing that are common in some of the Indus areas are these really fabulous feminine figurines. Now, these are common as far west as Europe. So we can't say these are early tantric figures, but they certainly hint at a kind of proto-Shakti practice, a belief in the power and the importance of the feminine. Beyond that, really, there's not a whole lot we can say. Everything else is more or less speculation. They might have been used for fertility, but that could mean a lot of different things. So we don't know, but it does, again, give us a hint when we move along. We see some images which seem similar centuries later. So we might be looking at what is really the beginning of some of the practices that evolved into what we call Tantra. Now, I know that y'all have probably all discussed realms of consciousness. And for those of you who haven't, I'll just very briefly mention that there are lots of ways of being conscious naturally. And one of the traditional ways in societies that are not based on cities and industrialized society is to really focus on the magic. Now, if you are close to nature and you believe you're not separate from nature, then you believe that you can affect nature. This is the basis of what we might call shamanism or magic. In other words, if you're connected, then you can alter it. If I can reach over and pick up this glass and drink from it, then I have power over it. I'm able to manipulate this. And in this way, this is one way of thinking about how people in the ancient world and still many indigenous peoples today, how they relate to the nature that's around them. And if you believe that you are connected, then there are ways that you can get what you want. And that can be as simple as, I saw this guy today and I just gotta have him. So you go to your local shaman, you get the potion, or you cast the spell, or you say the magic mantra. And in that way, if you really are tuned in, you actually can get what you want. It might be wealth. It might be to get relief from an illness or to bring illness onto somebody else. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is something you want to do that's good in societal terms or bad. It's simply, how can I manipulate nature? I'm part of nature, so there's got to be a way I can do it. So shamanism seems to develop all over the world in a similar way, that you have societies that are pre-industrial or even pre-agricultural, where you have spells, you have mantras, you have potions, all kinds of ways that are designed to manipulate and get what you want. Really, these don't, on the surface, have much to do with becoming one with the Godhead, with becoming, becoming one with everything. You already are one with everything, right? So you don't have to do that. That comes later. But this is important because, in a way, this is the foundation on which a lot of the tantric practices that many of you know are based. Any questions on that? Comments? It's a quiet bunch out there.
It's fascinating.
Okay. So now let's move on. So the Indus civilization collapses, or more or less it kind of loses steam. As I mentioned, people just move back to their villages, and really life goes back to the way it was. That is, small scale villages. People have agriculture, but it's not on a big scale. You don't have big kingdoms. Writing seems to vanish. People go back to a kind of an indigenous way of living for several centuries. And then over time, these new folks arrive. Now, you probably all have heard of the Aryan invasion, which is actually more or less a creation by the British in the 19th century, who were essentially seeing themselves as the new Aryans arriving on the Indian subcontinent. But now we know it's a different picture than was taught to many of us, and certainly the British imagined. So you had that area up in the northwest of India that I mentioned, Afghanistan, Persia, and that's an area that did not have much agriculture. People really were nomadic. They lived, they had horses, they had cows and sheep and goat. They weren't tied to the land in the same way that people in along the big rivers in India were. So around 1500 BC, those people said, hey, let's go to the place that's got lots of meadow, where it rains regularly, and where we might get a little war booty. And so they moved gradually into that area in northwest India. And this is where we get the first scripture from the Indian subcontinent. The Rig Veda is actually it's thought to be the oldest. And one of the mentions that's so fascinating is they talk about the long-haired Kesin, who are called vagabonds who travel with the wind, clad only in dust or yellow tatters, and being equally at home in the physical and the spiritual worlds. Now, there's a lot of debate about who these Kesins were and what it means, but I think I just read it as it states. It really sounds to me like these are some kind of proto-Nagas or holy men who are definitely practicing spiritual traditions and aren't very concerned with fine clothing. And in fact, they seem to resemble a lot of the Shiva followers that you would even see today in India. So again, that's speculation. We don't really know. But it certainly does sound like this is the root of this tradition of people who wander across the Indian subcontinent, wearing very little, maybe nothing, and they really live in an embodied way while practicing spiritual traditions. And this, I think, is a clear sign of what we might call proto-tantra in action.
Andrew.
Yes.
They came from the West.
That's correct.
This isn't the Genghis Khan.
No, this is much, much earlier. So this would be, go ahead.
No, I just said, okay.
Yeah, so these are people who, they speak Indo-European language. So they speak a very different language than the people in the Indian subcontinent. So they really are invaders, but they're more or less people who just gradually are immigrating to a better place. They're immigrants. And they bring with them very different traditions from those of the Indus civilization. they're bringing a whole different set of gods, sky gods. Most of the gods that we know from today from Indian tradition, or at least many of them, come from the pantheon of these people who came from this high and dry plateau, far, far from the wet areas along, say, the Ganges. So it's a very different culture that's moving in and meeting with these indigenous people who have been rooted there for a long time. And this fusion, this combination, is what creates this kind of unique traditions that we will explore now. And we talked about the magic. So what happens when you get people who do settle down and build cities and start to write? And what you get is the mythical. And what this means is that with farming and writing, you get gods, you get cities and kingdoms. Really, you get shared stories. So people begin to tell stories, and this binds them together. So you no longer are one with nature. You have separated yourself from nature, and you've created a society. You've created a more urban life in which your human relations and the human stories that you're sharing are central. So the magic begins to recede. And I think this can be said about societies all around the world, that the more they become centralized and you get your kings and you get your gods, then magic tends to take a back seat, slowly, gradually, and it happens in different ways in different societies. But I think it's fair to say that this is a common thread you see across time and space on our planet. And so after, say, 5, 6, 7 centuries, you begin to get these great scriptures, these amazing stories that start to be written down for the first time. Most of these are oral at the beginning, and a lot of them actually in India today, and Rudra can speak more about this, but there are places you can go where you can still sit down and you can hear people tell these magnificent stories that are still passed down orally. But more and more, as you get a more centralized society, people begin to write things. And that's where we get the Vedas, we get mantras, we get rituals, we get commentaries, philosophy, methods of spiritual development, such as meditation. For the first time, we're able to get a glimpse into what these people are actually doing and move a little bit away from speculation. So, and here's some of the Vedas below, and which of course end with the Upanishads. So these are not really comparable to the Bible, because we're talking about massive texts that just go on and on and on. They go all over the map. They're filled with not so much scripture, but interpretations and stories. And so it's a very lively, rich, complex world that is getting created, particularly in Northwest India during this period when what's happening in the West. Well, in the West, around that time, you've got the rise of the Assyrian Empire. You've got the rise of, in the Middle East, of an Israelite kingdom. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what's happening over in other parts of the world we tend to be more familiar with. So then we get to this fascinating time. And some scholars call it the Great Awakening, and you could actually apply it. It's not just happening in India, it's also happening in the Middle East. It's happening in certainly in Persia. But what happens is that people are beginning to move around, and as they begin to move around, they begin to bring their armies, but they also begin to bring their religious ideas and their own mythologies, because we're in the world of myth now, to other places. So the Ganges at this point, which has been really a very quiet place with some small villages, but not large populations. But suddenly, around 500 BC, you get this emergence of these very large settlements and cities and towns lining the Ganges, which is a fantastically fertile area. And this area just booms. So it becomes really the center of the urban reawakening. So the Indus is a little bit further to the west. It's collapsed a long time before, more than 1,000 years have gone by, and now things are beginning to grow up again into larger urban areas. Meanwhile, you got the Persians, the same people who sent us the folks from, who sent us the people who came and brought their gods and sky gods and herds, and you get a whole nother set of ideas coming in. Zoroastrianism, for example, that begins to move into India, and it in turn is influenced by what they're finding in India. Meanwhile, in India itself, and when I say India, I mean the Indian subcontinent, so that includes today's Pakistan and Bangladesh, you get Jainism and Hinduism and Buddhism are all taking their form, what we can call religions. It's not till around then that you can actually say these are religions. Before then, they're more traditions or cults or rites, but now you begin to see people with their own specific scripture, people with their own specific rituals, and they begin to take very definite forms. And then the West arrives in a new form. 326 BC, Alexander the Great invades. As you know, he came from Macedonia and conquered his way. Basically, he cut the head off the Persian Empire and became the Persian emperor. So, and then he expands the empire of Persia far into India. But he gets to the Indus River and there's a big battle and he's freaked out by the elephants and has to run away, basically, and loses a lot of his men. It's a little bit like Napoleon going into Russia. Alexander going to India, he bit off way more than he could chew. But as a result of this, the Indians begin to unite into the first large empire on the subcontinent. And this is really important because then Indians begin to really have contact with each other, and these religions that we know as Jains and Hindus and Buddhists begins to take real solid form. Now, I know it sounds like I'm not mentioning Tantra much, but just bear with me. And here's an example that amidst this society that gets formed in empires and kingdoms, kingdoms, we're talking about men here. I mean, this is a patriarchy. And, the men are the warriors, the men are in charge of the politics, and the men are the kings. So definitely a very strong patriarchy, which you still find in India. Yet, underneath that, there's this power of the feminine, which is still alive and kicking. And in some places, we get these hints. Now, remember, we don't have much writing, really, in India until the early centuries of the Common Era. So here's one quote. The king's minister caused to be built this most terrible... Hold on, I've got to move that so I can see it. Whoops. Hold on. Hold on a sec. I just have to move this out of the way. There we go. The king's minister caused to be built this most terrible of abodes, strewn with a multitude of the mothers that drove of joyous over-the-top gong bangers who are pumped up to the rain clouds on the powerful winds raised by the tantras. Now, what this means is disputed, but I think you get a sense of this underneath this kind of state, kingdom, patriarchy. You still have this power of the feminine, which is of Shakti, that is still in a way running this show. And they're building temples to the mothers. This is a temple of the mothers that dates back 1,000 years or so in the image. So unlike a lot of other cultures, for some reason, the feminine seems to remain more visible just under the surface in the Indian subcontinent. So this is when we can really talk about Tantra, because until this point, you really can't say what Tantra is. But by the time we start to get texts, and most of these texts involve esoteric magical spells and erotic rituals and kind of a shamanistic magic way of seeing the world, we don't really have much before then. But now we can actually read what they're saying. And you get these schools that begin to emerge, and you have schools devoted to Shakti and to Shiva, and you also get this tantric idea of the power of the feminine and the masculine playing off each other, appearing in Buddhism as well. something that we tend to, or I tend to forget, is I tend to think of Hindu Tantra, but Tantra begins to infuse all of these traditions in India, right? So it's not just it's not just Hinduism, but it's also Buddhism as well as the Jains, who are influenced by these indigenous traditions that have survived possibly from the Indus and are now part of these schools and traditions that are used in each of these new budding religions. And the big thing that happens in India at this point is around the 8th century, suddenly Hinduism, which has been kind of on the decline, it suddenly begins to reassert itself. It has a renaissance. And the Buddhists, who felt like they're the religion of the future, the Hindu folks, yeah, that's an old traditional way of being, but the Buddhists see themselves as internationalists. They see themselves as very adept in spiritual traditions. They're not so much interested in these complex rituals built up in Hinduism. They're really interested in enlightenment, in getting there. And they believe that you can get there. And you don't have to go through generations and generations of dying and being reborn, that actually it is accessible to you. So in a way, Buddhism becomes a kind of democratization of these religions, which had been staid and somewhat hierarchical from what we can tell. But by the 8th century, the Hindus learn a lot from the Buddhists, and they begin to, in a way, to mirror the Buddhists, and Shankaracharya and others begin to combat Buddhism by changing Hinduism, updating it, making it a little more fashionable and a little more streamlined, and getting rid of some of the more esoteric traditions that are more hierarchical. So this completely changes everything, because the Buddhists are gradually pushed out of India, or people lose their interest in Buddhism, and they begin to embrace Hinduism in this new way. So it's a radical shift. Yet throughout this, the Tantric traditions are maintained. So even though you've got this momentous change of this dominant religion loses power and begins to die off in the center where it began, nevertheless, the Tantric traditions remain in Buddhism, among Jains, as well as in Hinduism.
So when did we begin to see the migration of Tantra into the Taoist tradition?
Very good question. We're just about there.
Oh, great.
So this is the period, so we're in the early centuries CE. And this is a time when India is really booming. It's booming in terms of trade. It's booming in its religious, its ability to export religion. And everybody wants to go to India. The Chinese want to go to India. The Buddha was in India. The Chinese want to go to India to learn about Buddhism. They're less interested in Hinduism, but they come across the Himalaya to what was the Gupta Empire. And you see an image here of the Gupta Empire, which covered most of North India. So this is a really exciting time, because India is a center not just of an empire with its temporal power, but also the people who are running the show are really interested in the arts and the sciences. These aren't very different. And this does relate to Tantra, but I do want to mention that the mental is beginning to creep in here. So we have the mythical realm, and now we're starting to see this focus on abstraction. And this, in India, takes this form of these incredible advances, which in the West are often ignored. I certainly wasn't taught about most of these. I mean, these people invented the zero. These people invented the Arabic numeral system that we use today. Pi, chess, the astronomical advances they made were phenomenal. So it's important to keep that in context, that this is a time not just of temporal power, but this awakening of the mental. And it was not divorced from the body, not divorced from the arts, that this was all part of a package. So we're really just seeing the beginning of what we might call the mental frame of mind, but it had an enormous impact by creating, kind of laying the foundation for our modern world.
When is that, Andrew?
That would be in the first, I'd say from like the 4th to the 9th centuries CE. So basically the Dark Ages in Europe, what we call the Dark Ages. And this is also a time because there's a lot of money, there's a lot of wealth, and there are people in charge who really want to invest not just in building beautiful buildings, and trade. They want to invest in spiritual technologies. So you get this flowering of philosophical schools, and philosophy and religion were really not separate matters in those days. So you get, for example, probably the most, I don't know how you put it, but a very highly evolved version of Tantra, which is Kashmir Shaivism, which we've studied a little bit about. And there's this non-dualistic idea, this idea that there is not separation. And so really it's about, in a sense, it's using these spiritual technologies to get back to being at one with nature. That would be a very simple way of putting it. But you have these amazing teachers like Abhinavagupta who begin to revolutionize the way the way we meditate, the way we understand chakras and energy movement. This is really when we start to see, or at least we can see it in the writings and the traditions, we start to see what we might call Tantra. You start to get these terms left-handed or right-handed. So what's happening is this very strange thing. On the one hand, you have this Vedic tradition, which is very rule-based. It's all about following the rules. You got to do this the right way. You've got to cook the right way. You don't want to get near somebody who's not in your caste. You know, it's a very controlled society. And yet there's this other piece, which is not talked about as much, but which we get hints of this transgressive belief system where black is white and white is black, where you do eat meat, where you do all kinds of erotic work that you wouldn't do in your traditional Vedic way. So it's fascinating that it endures and survives. It's not suppressed as it is in places like medieval Europe, where the erotic really has to begin to go underground. Here, for reasons that are really complicated, this tradition survives. And this is what makes Tantra so unusual and fascinating, is that despite this rule-based way of seeing the world, you have this kind of revolutionary, left-handed, transgressive tradition, which is in the tradition that is very, very much part of society. So I think this is one of the things that makes Tantra so unusual, is that it wasn't suppressed in the same way as you find in the West. And you get things like Khajuraho, and this is one place that we visited during our trip with Ravi, was this astonishing series of temples in central India, both Hindu and Jain temples, that are filled with the most amazing erotic sculpture. I mean, temple after temple after temple. So it's something that you certainly would not have seen in Europe. You wouldn't have seen it in the Islamic traditions that were right on the borders with India at that time, and you wouldn't see this in China either. So it's fairly unusual. There are some traditions where you do see a lot of erotic painting and sculpture, but not on this scale. So we don't really know what it meant. There's almost nothing written about Khajuraho. So it's still there. It's a World Heritage Site, and it's obvious that it's filled with erotic sculpture. But what they meant by this remains a little opaque. And I think we need to be careful about putting our ideas about what this means on them. I mean, was this their version of porn? Was it all symbolic? I mean, these are questions we simply cannot answer. But we can say that this erotic and also with the focus on the feminine in many of these sculptures, you know, clearly Shakti is alive and well and welcomed, at least in parts of India and parts of the society, around 1000 CE. And
Andrew,
yes,
may I ask a question?
sure.
I'm curious. My name is Jody. I'm curious if you have any sense of why this was allowed to exist and even thrive, almost like right next to. I studied medieval European history for my bachelor's degree, and so I know a lot about how much suppression happened. And I'm curious if you have any sense or if there's any information out there as like if this has something to do with the acceptation of the different realms of consciousness, or why this more feminine energy and erotic energy was not suppressed more.
I think this is what you've just asked is one of the most important questions you can ask about the tantric tradition. And I'm hoping that Raviji has a very succinct answer to that question.
What's that? Well, yeah, I'll say a word or two. I think that it's the character. Well, two things. One is this culture in India, which is and has been so diverse, could exist only with an amazing level of tolerance. So people have a sense of, well, I don't understand what that group does, but that's their problem, and I'm doing what I and you know, when you go into a city in India, and you know, you think, well, what language do they speak here? Well, they speak probably 6 or 8 languages, and there may be one language that's more frequent in that area, but people live in cities from all over India. They move to another city. They don't necessarily ever learn the language there because they have members of their community who live there, and they associate with them and they interact with them. So you couldn't possibly condemn. I mean, how would you condemn something? Because there's so many things going on and you don't understand any of them, and don't want to understand them. It's just too much trouble. So that's one thing, is the tolerance. Also, I think the respect for the feminine really means the respect for spanda, or spontaneity, and so the erotic has a much more honored and obvious or unavoidable place, you know, because that's part of the aliveness. And so India has been it's just been a place where you know, all kinds of things happen on all kinds of different levels, and nobody's running around trying to police that. So there's a respect and a tolerance and respect for many different traditions. And also it's important to realize that overall in India, Prem Saran, who's a writer from the Guwahati, he says that Tantra has been a counterculture. And, you know, India does have its focus on the institutions that contribute to shaping the lives of people to be spiritual. And so it's very careful about how it raises children. Children are extremely important. They always go everywhere. You don't just push the children off somewhere. And so they want things to be done in a way that are conducive to healthy healthy mentally and physically children. So they, you know, a little bit of naked, I mean, people running around naked, well, that's just what some people do. But a frank sexuality is relatively rare in a public sphere. So you have this counterculture that does embrace the very obvious erotic and sexual actions, and that's Tantra. And so Tantra, you know, if you think about the 1960s in the US, well, there were all these new or recovery of old ways of thinking about eroticism and sexuality and everything in the 60s. And that became our counterculture. So the main culture had what we would call very conservative attitudes, but the counterculture embraced all of this, but it also kept itself somewhat separate, or was forced to be separate. And so many cultures will have a counterculture, but especially notable in the 60s in the US and in India, consistently has had this counterculture that is Tantra, which operates quietly and you know, it sometimes is out in the open, but people don't look at it. You know, they just look the other way. They don't want to see it because you don't mess with the tantrikas because they have powers and they might zap you. So just better give them, you know, wide berth and go on with what you're doing and ignore it. It's not for me. It's just, that's what they do. I'm not interested. And so all these things add up to the possibility of this tradition continuing in an unbroken fashion for millennia. And that's just very unusual. So that's what makes, now I'm not answering your question anymore, but I'm just a little plug for Tantra. That's one of the things that makes it so valuable, is that it's this long-standing, deeply spiritual, highly evolved tradition that melds spirituality and sexuality, and that's a resource for all the other cultures in the world. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think that comes right to the point of, you know, the spread of Tantra, you know, beyond India, which began to happen in what we would call medieval times, you know, say until the 12th century, where, and this is something that we often are not taught in the West, is that India became fantastically influential in Asia. The Indian traders, Sanskrit was spoken in Vietnam. You had traders all over Southeast Asia who were learning about Buddhism and Hinduism and Tantra. If you go to many of the great Angkor Wat, for example, in Cambodia, I was astonished by how similar what you see there is to Khajuraho. Lots of erotic sculpture, often which is not highlighted for the tourist, but it's there if you look. And the asparas, these beautiful women, are everywhere in the sculpture, very erotic. So I think this is something scholars have overlooked, because people tend to be a scholar in Hinduism or Buddhism, and Tantra is, as Ruji mentioned, it's kind of in the background, and it's often hard to pinpoint. And there are very few scholars that have looked at the overseas impact that India had during this period. And I think it's much greater than we have been, that scholars have thought in the past century or so. And this map just gives you a sense of where things were moving. They were going everywhere. I mean, this is where Japan got its, not just its Buddhism, but a lot of its Buddhist tantric ideas. So you have this flowering not just within India, but all across Asia. And not just Asia, because it also got to the West. And many of you, well, Arabella certainly knows about Sufism, which is the mystical tradition within Islam. So Islam comes out of Arabia in the 7th century CE, moves across the Middle East, Persia, and pretty quickly they're at the gates of India. By the 13th century, they really are running the show in India. And it's not just a one-way street, though, because the Sufis who existed previously, but they get to India and then everything changes. I was at this place you see here, this beautiful architecture here. It's called Gazargah. It's outside of Herat in Western Afghanistan. It's a tomb to an ancient Sufi mystic. And I was there with a UNESCO official, and it's a strange place because I've been to tons of mosques, which were always fine. It was fine to go into a mosque and as a white guy from America, but there was something different when we got to this place. We walked in, and it's mostly outside. It's this giant courtyard, and there are spaces inside, but everyone was just hanging out. There were just lots and lots of people hanging out and talking and smoking and just kind of just doing their thing. But it had a different feel. It felt completely welcoming, and it felt like I was not a stranger there. No one was going to be looking at me and judging me. And I said to the UNESCO guy, he knew the place well, I was like, what's different here? He said, oh, well, these are Sufis. I'm like, you mean the people here now? He said, oh yeah. And I looked over at that moment, and there was this man who had a long robe, looked like your typical Afghan guy, who's maybe in his 40s, and he was doing this strange, this. And at first I thought, oh wow, is he crazy, or he's got some physiological problem? And I looked at the UNESCO guy, and he said, we're only a few hundred miles from India. I'm like, oh, he was doing breathing techniques. So, there's an example where even today in Afghanistan, you have clearly the influence of these spiritual traditions from India, and I would call them Tantra. I couldn't say that what he was doing was Tantric, but clearly he was influenced by that tradition, which had worked its way out of India and into Afghanistan, and then across. In fact, you find this even in Spain. There are some traditions, Sufi traditions, which seem to come from India. Now that might sound crazy. It's several thousand miles away, but remember, the Islamic Empire at that point stretched all the way from India to Spain. So there were trade routes. It was safe to move for several centuries across these areas. So we can't just dismiss the idea that Tantra actually made its way into the West in some very profound ways, and not just into the Islamic world, I would argue, but possibly, and this is where it's a little speculative, but I think it's fascinating, to Europe as well. There's a wonderful story of Saint Francis, who during the Crusades went to the Holy Land. He didn't actually make it to the Holy Land, but he did get to Egypt. And there's this great story of him meeting both the Sultan of Egypt as well as Sufis. And there's this lovely image here you'll see upper right of him meeting the Sultan and having a discussion. And supposedly, this is again a legend, but Francis hung out with the Sufis while he was in Egypt. So a lot of what Francis brought back to Europe in his belief about how we're not separate from nature, how we are, how the Lord of Animals. I mean, if Francis isn't the Lord of Animals, who is? He's the patron saint of animals. All of these like little hints that this Catholic monk from Italy was influenced by traditions that had their root in distant India. Troubadours are another kind of fascinating example. The troubadour is actually an Arabic word, but there's kind of scholarly agreement that the troubadours were the result of input from Spain, Islamic Spain, which in turn was influenced by India. So there's talk that Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was practicing tantric traditions. Now, I don't know how far to take that, but I think it's just a reminder that the world was much more porous than we imagined. So we don't necessarily have to think of Tantra as this distant alien tradition about which we know nothing. No, in fact, I think our culture has already been influenced by these tantric traditions. And there's also legends. Again, these are just legends. There's no documents and no proof, but legends of Jesus visiting India have been pervasive, not just in the past couple of centuries when India became fashionable in the West, but dating back to medieval times. So I think these are all hints that the tantric practices, which had largely been suppressed or driven underground in Europe and in the Islamic world, were alive and well in India and made their way as kind of exotic ideas, which could be maybe more easily accepted because they came from a foreign country and they weren't associated with devils necessarily. So I just think it's a really intriguing idea that we have always been imbued with Tantra to a certain extent. We just didn't know it. Anybody have any thoughts or questions? I love this guy's codpiece. Isn't that amazing? The guy in the bottom right. So the next thing I want to talk about is the decline of Tantra. And you might say, decline? What do you mean? You're talking about it spreading all over the world. What's the decline? Well, it did decline in the sense that within India, it lost its cachet among the rich and powerful. So the royal patronage, which had been so central to the development of Kashmir Shaivism and these other great schools and philosophies, which, you know, if you're going to be a philosopher, it takes money to sit around and think and to come up with poetry and do those kinds of things. And that kind of patronage dried up in the late medieval period. And there are several reasons for that. India kind of fell apart because of the Islamic invasions that penetrated the subcontinent. And it really changed things because some Muslim rulers were very tolerant. If you look at the Taj Mahal, for example, it's a lovely example of this melding of West meaning the Islamic world, with East meaning India. You know, that is a symbol of these two very different cultures coming together. But remember, going back to the times of the Vedic invasions, you had these people coming in from the West. So the fact that the Islamic armies and rulers and people were moving in as immigrants into India and as conquerors was actually just the latest in the series of waves of people moving into India from the dry and rather difficult northwest area of Afghanistan and Persia, where it's hard to make a living. So eventually Tantra loses its patronage. There are Islamic rulers who want to have nothing to do with this erotic stuff and with this magic stuff, which is in traditional Islamic thinking, which is very much like traditional Christian thinking, is just abhorrent. It's the devil. It's nothing to do with anything spiritual, and it must be suppressed. But I want to be careful here because it's a very long history and a complicated history, and it's not like the Islamic people came in and they were intolerant and they destroyed Tantra. That's not what happened. It was just ups and downs, but over time, Tantra really went into the closet. And then come the Victorians. You think the Islamic rulers are bad. So this image at the bottom, I can't believe I found it. If any of you read or read the book Passage to India or saw the movie years ago, there's this wonderful scene which I think encapsulates the new meeting of East and West, of Tantra meeting the industrializing mental West. And there's a figure in the book, this lovely innocent young woman who comes from England, and she's of course ensconced in the British colonial life there until she makes the dreadful mistake of going for a bike ride. And in going for that bike ride, she's wheeling through the lovely Indian countryside on a nice day, and she sees a ruin. She's English. She's drawn to ruin. She goes to the ruin, and lo and behold, when she gets up close to look at these beautiful ancient carvings, what does she see? Oh my God, that figure at the top there. And she's like, oh no. She sees this erotic activity in stone. I mean, this is so shocking. And at that moment, all these monkeys appear. And she freaks out. And it really just destroys her neat little mental world of English, of British domination and colonialism over these these poor barbaric people. Suddenly there's this whole world which she doesn't really want to open up to, but of course it ultimately does change her. So the Victorians had a similar influence to the Muslims in that they weren't interested in Tantra. They thought it was pretty awful stuff, and they suppressed it. And they also brought their own laws against homosexuality that were still on the books until very recently in India. Some of their laws about the Victorian laws regarding sex are still on the books in today's modern India. So a lot of what we see in India today is a result of a century or more of British domination bringing their rules and their ideas into the works, and Tantra had to go further underground. But Tantra does get to the West, and this is such a fabulous, crazy story. The omnipotent this guy named Pierre Bernard goes to Bengal. We know very little about what he did there, who he met, who he studied with, but then, boom, 1906, he's in, of course, San Francisco, and he starts to teach yoga and tantric initiation. And these are the terms that he's using. Now, basically, we can't say for sure who his teachers were, what exactly he was teaching, but he creates this tremendous national scandal. This quote is great. "I cannot tell you how Bernard got control over me or how he gets it over other people," said one of his alleged kidnappees, Zelaha. Not a great name. "He is the most wonderful man in the world. No women seem able to resist him." He goes on to New York to found the New York Sanskrit College, and there are all of these scandalous reports of his Oriental music and women making strange noises, but not those of distress. So it's just, it blows everyone's mind. Now, the odd thing is that Bernard goes on to leave his Tantra teaching. He became a New York banker and became quite wealthy. But that's another story. The point is that when Tantra reaches the United States for the first time, identified as Tantra, identified as, they use that word, then that colors the way Americans and Europeans, Westerners in general, see and understand Tantra. And this is vital, I think, to know when your students are like, well, Tantra, it's about sex, right? Because this is how it reached us, not as an indigenous tradition, which is about the magical, our relation to nature, or about becoming one. It reached us as a sex scandal.
Andrew, may I interject?
Yes.
So here's an interesting correlation with Pierre Bernard. At his Sanskrit Institute, his half-sister was there visiting, and Pierre Vilayet's father, who was a Sufi teacher, went to the Sanskrit Institute and fell in love with Pierre Bernard's sister, Ora Ray Baker, married her, and she became the Begum in the Sufi tradition.
That's mind-blowing. I had no idea.
Yeah.
That's great. Somebody really should do a book about this guy.
Yeah.
And his family. Fascinating. Well, it's interesting, to think that the Sufi tradition and Tantra, again, are finding their way to each other, even in the West at that date. Yeah. So what we get then in the West is, and I use this word, I put it in quotes, neo-Tantra. I don't mean this to be pejorative. I don't mean to put down people who think of Tantra as, or tantric sex as, Tantra is about sex. I don't mean to say it's not. I would say it's not all about sex, and it's probably not about sex in the way that we tend to think of it in the West. But it's really vital that we recognize that we're seeing one little slice of the tantric tradition that kind of has taken over as meaning our societal view of what Tantra is. If you stop a person in the street, or at least a person in the street here in Asheville, I don't know about where you are, if you ask them about Tantra, they're gonna say, oh, right, you know, like sacred sex. And so we wanna be aware of this when we're talking to students, so that we can use that as a way to enter into a deeper conversation about, well, yes, but here's something more than just sex that it's really about. It's about energy. You know, sex is very energetic. So there are ways that we can use this kind of mental knowledge I'm giving you to get into the minds and hearts of our students, so that when we talk about this, we can help them to see the word and the tradition in a fresh way, which I think is vital to get out of the mindset that was created a century ago that we're still kind of stuck with. Now we need to talk about Tantra in India, because it's a completely different story. I mean, it's like night and day. So while here, Tantra came to be about sacred sex and candles and bells, in India, it became voodoo. So as Tantra declined, meaning as it gets less royal patronage and is treated less seriously by, particularly by Hindu practitioners, it becomes you could say, kind of a country tradition. It goes out back into the villages where it probably started. So people in villages who are still connected to nature in India, they start to, they begin to use Tantra as it probably was in the beginning. That is, to get what you need. You know, I want to get the girl, I want to get the guy, I want to get the cow, I want that person dead, I want this person to live. So the Tantric traditions that began in the magic realm kind of sink back into that. And so that's the view, at least, from many people in urban India today. So if you speak to, as I did, many people in places like New Delhi, when you say, oh, I'm here to study Tantra, they kind of back away from you. It would be like coming across somebody here and saying, oh, well, I've come to America to study voodoo. It would just be a little off-putting, because it's not considered a real spiritual tradition. Voodoo, of course, is a real spiritual tradition, but I'm using kind of the pejorative term voodoo. So Tantra is black magic in Indian parlance today, abracadabra and hocus pocus, and correct me if I'm wrong if Stephen Powell is on the line here, but I believe that those are considered kind of tantric mantras. They're not, maybe they actually are, I don't know the history of them, but I was told that those are terms associated with Tantra in India today. So, and these are some of the ads and some of the movies and popular culture, how Tantra is seen and how Shiva and Shakti are seen in Indian popular culture. So in other words, it's a tradition that belongs to the country bumpkins who believe in magic. It's superstitious and it's a little embarrassing, and but also kind of sexy in that way that we have movies about vampires, right? So this is also critical to know. If you go to India and you proudly tell people that you studied Tantra, you need to understand how an Indian might react to that, so that you can have a conversation and not be speaking in very different ways. So I'm going to wrap up here, and I'm hoping we'll get some more questions, but please chime in whenever you want. What is Tantra? Somebody says to you, what is Tantra? What are you going to tell them? What do you tell yourself? So this last little bit, I've just pulled together a few quotes that have been very helpful for me. These aren't about spiritual technologies. This is not about how to breathe. This is not about how to do meditation. This is more like a way to step back and ask, what is this really all about? So there's a wonderful book called Roots of Tantra. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend it. And in one of the papers in this, Gudrian says that Tantra is a systematic quest for salvation or for spiritual excellence by realizing and fostering the bipolar, bisexual divinity within one's body. So in other words, Tantra is a way of bringing together Shiva and Shakti, of the masculine and feminine coming together. Now, I know that language might not appeal to some people, you know, it's very gendered, but I think it's useful to think about the way and, you know, how radical this is. It is about bringing together those parts which seem to be completely different and opposite, but realizing that they're not. And this is happening in your body, not in your mind, not in a myth, and not even the realm of the magical. This is actually happening in your physical body. And this other quote I love, this tantric vision, which includes ritual and manipulation of power and transgression of norms, use of the mundane to reach the supramundane, and identification of the microcosm with the macrocosm. So you all know as within, so without. This is a fancy way of saying that. But I think this is the idea of holding these differences that are so opposite and yet are poles that are connected. And how do we use these differences to then take the next step, to move from the mundane into the supramundane, which doesn't mean getting out of your body. It means, in a sense, going into your body, going into the roots. Now, George Forrestine is he's a scholar who's written a lot about Tantra, and in Urban's book that's called Tantra, he says, Tantra is India's most radical contribution to spirituality. The underlying idea of Tantrism is that even the most mundane occurrence can serve as a means of transcendence. And this is just, it's fantastic. Now you'll find this idea in Sufism, you'll find it in Buddhism, you'll find it in Christianity even, but I think in Tantra, it's really central. This idea that we're not trying to get out of our bodies. We're not trying to reach for some spiritual goal. In fact, we're trying to sink into something. We're trying to transcend by being even more mundane, by taking the smallest moment and really feeling the miracle of Shakti in life and juice and power in that moment. And I think that's just a very non-dogmatic, powerful idea. And then Mishra, who wrote this fantastic book, Kashmir Shaivism, it's a bear to plow through, but there's some real gems in it. And he says the tantric way of life amalgamates or synthesizes involvement and renunciation, assimilating the merits of both, and at the same time discarding the defects. Take what you want, leave the rest. Tantric life is basically spiritual, with the material life carried out as the free expression of the spirit. The profane becomes sacred, and material life itself becomes spiritual. And this is, I think, one of the most radical notions that Tantra provides us with. That is that we don't have to seek to get out of our bodies, to move up our chakras so we can blow through our skulls to become one with a deity or an energy that's way up there. That actually we want to come down. We want to accept that the material life itself is spiritual, that Shakti, that messy power that sits at our root, is actually the center of the sacred life of being. And that rather than running away from her, rather than trying to find a distraction to get away from her, we actually find a way to recognize her as sacred. And this is a powerful idea, because if you really can take this in, it completely alters one's relationship to the feminine and masculine, to up and down, that going up is good, going down is bad. All of these ideas, I think, that are rooted in our culture can be slowly pruned by embracing this kind of very radical idea. And just a couple more. Mishra also wrote this, that the tantric way is an attempt to break the false barriers of the individual and of society. that Tantrism is the way of becoming existentially nude by stripping oneself of all the artificial coatings of the individual and social personality. The Tantric aims at becoming free, not undisciplined.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is a real challenge for us in the West. When we say free, it's, I want to take my clothes off and have sex in the woods whenever I want. Who are you to tell me not to? But this is a much subtler message that is very powerful. That it's not that the barriers of the individual and society are bad. We need society, we need barriers, and we need to have rules, we need the social norms. India certainly is a place that is filled with the most intense social norms you're likely to find anywhere. They developed this incredible caste system, which is, it's all about your place in this society. And maybe Tantrism was necessary for a society that produced often, not always, but often a very restrictive set of boxes for where you belong. And this is a way of stepping out of that and realizing that it's necessary, but it is not who you actually are. But to get there, you don't just do it by yelling at your parents and taking your clothes off and running out of the woods. That actually you have to be very, very disciplined. That this is why Tantra is filled with so much hard work. You know, meditation can be really hard. Even on the best days, it could be a challenge. The breathing technique can be frustrating, can take years and years. Mantras are hard to really grasp and to really get inside of you. I'm speaking for me at least. So this requires great discipline, but this is vital to be free. This is what tantrikas who have worked for thousands of years to see what works and what doesn't. You know, gather data, this works, this doesn't work. And this is what they're passing down to us. So this discipline is really a gift that's coming from thousands of years, which is something which we can tend to kind of push away because it involves hard work. But if we want to be free, then it requires that we find those teachers and those traditions that can really provide us with the kind of the spiritual backbone that's necessary to be able to step beyond our individual and societal norms. Here's a wonderful Swami that we met when we were in India with Ravi, Swami Bharati, and he said this: Tantra considers the universe to be a manifestation of pure consciousness. Through this process of manifesting consciousness, consciousness divides itself into two parts, which cannot exist without one another. Though appearing to divide, they actually remain one and the same. So again, this idea that this idea of separation, which we created, right, as we moved out of our more indigenous world into an agricultural and industrial society, that's an illusion. That actually it is one and the same. And the Tantra is simply kind of reeling us back into what we already know, what we already did as humans. We're doing something different now, but that doesn't mean that we can't access what we knew long ago. So I think this is a really beautiful, simple way of grasping, again, the radical nature of Tantra. And then Pandit Rajmani, again, he has this wonderful quote: Tantrics have always discarded conventional standards of morality, ethics, and purity whenever those standards were found to be obstacles to the process of personal growth and self-discovery. Yet, their liberal and scientific approach has prevented them from forming a tantric religion. At a spiritual level, it consists of a set of techniques for gaining access to the multi-level forces within the human body and cosmos. Again, you know, this is so succinct in explaining why Tantra did become Hinduism or Jainism. It didn't become another ism. In fact, Tantrism is not even really a concept. It's a construct that we've used in the West, but it's not really widely talked about that way in India. So the point that I think he's making is that to be free, you got to do a lot of work, and you've got to find techniques, and that what matters is the techniques which will allow a greater level of freedom within your body and the cosmos. But as soon as you get wrapped up in religion and you get stuck with a dogma, and then you get rules, and then and this is what we humans do, right? We always do this. But Tantra is a way to kind of slip from that noose, slip out of that in order to get at something that is more satisfying. And this scientific approach, well, I think what he means by that is gathering the data, as Ravi talks about so much, gathering the data, doing the experiment, gathering the data, and then applying it. It's like using our minds and fine-tuning these techniques. And for all of us, they'll be different. One person will just be naturally drawn to mantra. Another person will just love to do silent meditation. Another person will want to do breathing techniques. Another person is going to want to just go out in the woods and walk around naked. I mean, everybody will be drawn to different techniques. But we have a suite that's available, and there's no dogma that says what you should or shouldn't do. It really is about knowing yourself. And last, this is the last slide, I wanted to discuss an important topic, and that's about appropriation. This is a very critical time in our culture to confront appropriation. And of course, that means, am I, in the case of Tantra, am I at the salad bar of indigenous traditions, just taking something that looks kind of appetizing to me, not really giving it the respect and the time it deserves? And now there's no right or wrong here, I think, when it comes to Tantra, because as we've seen, Tantra is not a religion. It doesn't have any requirements. It doesn't say you have to be Hindu or Buddhist. It doesn't say you have to be white or black. It has no rules, unlike, say, the Catholic Church or Islam or Hinduism. It's different. So I think that that makes Tantra a little bit different from the conversation about appropriation, which is going on around the world right now. What else do I want to say about this before I go to Ditchkowski? As we've seen, Tantra was moving through very many different traditions and around the world for centuries. So again, nobody owns Tantra. There's no ethnic group that says, we are the real Tantrikas. What are you doing teaching Tantra? You can't do that. You're a white person. You are taking my tradition. Now, there may be groups in India that might disagree with what I'm doing or what you're doing, but I think that Tantra is a little bit outside of this conversation about appropriating, and for another reason, and that is this quote from Mark Ditchkowski, who's a Sanskrit scholar we visited. He lives on the banks of the Ganges. He was fascinated by our group. I was horrified. I thought, oh my God, he's going to think we're a bunch of neo-Tantra, flaky California people coming to India to study. I mean, I was kind of mortified when we met him. And he hung around with our group. He would come up in the mornings, we were meditating, and just kind of sit with us. And he was really interested in us, which shocked me. And at one point I asked him, I said, so are we doing something here that's kind of flaky and irreverent? And he said, look, Tantra is dead in India. You are putting life back into it. It has always evolved. Being a receptacle of a tradition, a recipient of a tradition, and one of the tradition holders, it's a matter of knowing a tradition, respecting it profoundly, and doing to some extent your duty of transmitting it to others the best you can. This is just it was very gracious, I think, for him to suggest that we were doing something new and putting life back into this truly amazing gift that has come to us out originally of the Indian subcontinent. So I think that it's incumbent on us, if we're studying Tantra or call ourselves Tantrikas or studiers of Tantra, to know something about this broad tradition, not just our particular lineage, but to be able to speak about it a little more broadly and to really give it the respect to, if people say, oh, right, Tantra is about sex, to say, Well, no, it's not. And to maybe try and bring a little subtlety into that discussion, that's the way of bringing respect to this tradition. That's the way we can inject it with more life. That's a way that I think we can help it to move on to the next level so that it can evolve into something completely different. Okay. I would love to hear more questions, and maybe some of y'all have some answers that I don't have.
Andrew, could you take screen share down so we can see each other?
Yes, happily.
Thank you.
Right.
There you go. So I have a question about alchemy.
Great.
Because you didn't actually touch on that, except I think that there was one slide where you were talking about the abundance of information coming out of the Indian Peninsula with the founding of the zero and the Arabic numbers and astrology, etc. So, but I'm not sure the framework there, the timetable, I mean.
Yeah, alchemy certainly was a big part of that period I mentioned. That was an oversight not to throw that in. And part I didn't use it because for those people who don't know much beyond alchemy, then, oh yeah, people trying to turn lead into gold.
Right.
You know, it can seem like a superstitious tradition rather than a scientific one. But of course, even in Europe, it was the basis for the revolution in chemistry that took place.
Right.
Yeah, so alchemy was a, and I'm sorry, Helen is no longer, is Helen here? She's not here.
No, Helen's internet went down, and so she
I've used that excuse before. Yes, Helen really knows far more than I do about alchemy. Is there anybody else here who is steeped in alchemy? Obviously, Ravi can speak about this if you'd like.
Ravi?
Yeah, I think that for us as sort of Euro spinoffs, I mean, we're so much a part, you know, have so much influence of European culture, that it's worth noting that in a way the whole realm of the magical and to some extent the mythical, but the magic structure of consciousness, the awareness of the subtle energy, the awareness of our intimate immersion in nature, and what Andrew was talking about, a capacity to make things happen through the energetic connections, that was pretty well snatched away from the people by the church in Europe, and was the purvey of the priests and the bishops and the hierarchy of the church. So they had something to do with that, but you weren't supposed. And if you messed around there, you know, you could be accused of devil worship and burned at the stake at one period. And so a lot of that aspect of our being went underground in Europe, but it didn't have to in India, but in Europe, as Andrew said, it had to go underground. And where it went was to some extent into the alchemical tradition. And that was kind of the refuge of this whole aspect of our being in Europe for a long period of time. It was held in the secret work of the alchemists who were talking about the marriage between the masculine and feminine, were talking about the erotic, but in very veiled terms and in ways that it would be hard for an outsider to decipher. So yeah, alchemy definitely had a link back through to the Indian, well, the wisdom of the East, let us say, but it was held quietly and inconspicuously because it had to be.
I thought all of this has been really interesting and intriguing. Much of it is very new to me. So first, just thank you. In particular, I'm very interested in how many different roots seem to be, or how many branches seem to be rooted in some tantric traditions. And I'm very curious about if anyone knows if there is discourse around Buddhist roots in Tantra, if any at all. And I think my question is mostly coming from my own particular interest in Buddhism, but also just from the chronology that you went through. It seems like it could be possible. So yeah, I'm curious if anyone knows anything about that.
Well, all I could say is that, yes, Tantra certainly pervades Buddhism because it grew up at the same time as Hinduism did. Tibetan Tantrism, I think, has gotten more, Tibetan Buddhist Tantrism has gotten a lot more attention from scholars for a lot of reasons, because Tibetan stuff is kind of cool. But there are other places like Nepal, which the Buddhist traditions have survived in and very much are related to Tantra. I can't really speak about specifically how it's different. How is Buddhist Tantrism different from Hindu Tantrism? I think the basic principles are the same. They remain the same throughout all the traditions, but each one has its own. So if you think of it as a tree that begins down here in the time of indigenous culture, and then as it moves and grows and changes, you get these different branches, and then different branches off that and different leaves. So it's an immensely complicated structure, but I can't say anything more specifically. I think if you're interested, there's a lot written about Tibetan Buddhism Tantra that actually combines with some of the native Bon indigenous tradition of Tibet. So that's one reason it's interesting. It's Tantra that comes from India, and also a Tantrism that probably has its roots as well in ancient pre-Buddhist Tibet.
That's neat. I in particular find it interesting how, at least what I gathered from what I heard tonight, how Tantra as a practice seems unattached to anything that became a religion. And I wonder if that is part of the stem that perhaps allowed it to be an influence for so many different things without becoming, a branch that became so characterized over time. And last thing I'll say, and then that's it from me. Those two quotes from Mishra I enjoyed in particular. Very wordy, but so much in there. Thanks for sharing those.
Right. Okay, come on, let's ask questions here.
I have a question, Andrew. Or Joe, go ahead, Joe.
Thank you, Adam. In the grand arc that you're talking about, this great historical arc, it seems to me we're coming full circle. Am I right to say we start in a nomadic culture and the magical culture, move into civilization and mythology, etc., and then moved into more the more scholarly, educational aspects, and that Tantra kind of is returning us back to nature and to not so much in the head anymore, much more in the spirit and the body. Is that an accurate characterization?
Well, certainly Rudaji will have more to say about this, but I could just say briefly that I don't think it's a return. I think it's a way for us to remember other realms of consciousness that we've kind of let slide, that we've not been trained in, that we've not been reminded about. So the tantric techniques are there to bring us back to what we already knew, but it's not about returning to just returning to nature. I don't know about you, but as much as I love indigenous cultures I visited, I want to have central heating, and I want to have my iPhone. So I think what Tantra offers us today is a way to retrieve these realms of consciousness that we've ignored or haven't been properly taught about, And to integrate them, if you integrate these different realms, if I can live in the magical and the mythical and the mental, if I can pull those together, then I can live a freer, richer, far more interesting and juicy life.
Yes, I totally agree with what Andrew said. And so I just want to add that we say that Tantra is an integral discipline, and that what he is describing and what the Upanishads describe is the integral structure of consciousness, where we hold all the others transparently, all of them at once, transparently, and are totally aware of all dimensions. And this is what we might call enlightenment. But it seems to be the next developmental phase for human life. And in many ways, writers and very wise people have detected the movement toward that in the last 100 years that is gaining momentum. And it may look like we're losing our minds and losing everything else, but actually it may be the disintegration that's moving us into this integral structure of consciousness, which was described in the Upanishads way, and is an integral part also of Tantra. So that word integral is maybe something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew, I wanted to ask about sort of the lineage that got us here today with the teachings that Swami Rama brought with him in terms of, it seems to be more explicitly about the yogic teachings. And I'm curious if you or Swami Ravi or whomever could provide some clarity around how we might discern between Tantra, yoga, what Swami Rama brought, and what we're here today for.
I'd love to pass that off to Swami Ravi.
Well, so yes, Swami Rama was a great yogi, there's no doubt. He demonstrated that in the lab, he demonstrated that in his life. But he was also an extremely well-trained yogi, and was trained in the spiritual traditions all of India from early childhood. If you read his book, Living with the Himalayan Masters, it's the stories of all the teachers he visited and what he learned from each one. It's really beautiful. And so what he brought us in the West, what he brought to America specifically, also to Europe, but to America for us, was a distillation of those things that we could grasp, that were accessible for us, because anybody who has just jumped into studying Indian spirituality can feel overwhelmed and confused. So he selected the parts that were digestible for us and put them together and offered them to us, and then showed us a way to go deeper and deeper and deeper if we wanted to, and find the most integrated approach or understanding of what that spiritual tradition is, because there are many different pathways and many different traditions, but they all lead to the same point. So where do we start? Well, we start with what we can grasp, and that's what he came and lived in America for 20 years and refined his offering to be something that Americans can grasp. And then once you get into it in depth, then you can go further on your own, and you find that point where, they're all coming together here. But at first it doesn't look that way at all. So maybe that helps you understand a little bit about it's yoga, it's Tantra, it's Vedanta, it's all of that. But it was distilled to what we can grok, us, Americans. And then once we're into it and we go a little further, then we begin to follow that thread, and it takes us to where, well, oh yeah, I can see that's true of this, that's true of this, that's true of this. It's really all saying the same thing. Does that help, Adam?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, and for folks that don't know, Swami Rama was your teacher.
Yes, Swami Rama was my teacher. And I studied with him very intensively, 6 hours a day, one-on-one, many days for 20 years. And I consider myself unbelievably fortunate to have had that much training and that much input from him, because he was very much in demand all over the world, and people wanted his time, but for some reason I was fortunate enough to get so much of his time, and that's my commitment, is to pass on what he gave me. And yeah.
Well, we're running out of time. We've got time for one more burning question. Anyone?
I did want to, if anyone is interested in reading, this is The World of Tantra, is a really rare and unusual book that could give you some insight into the way Tantra is discussed in India. This goes back to the 1930s and 40s, but it's a powerful book that I go back to again and again just to pick up and read. It's a very beautiful story of a young boy who comes to understand a tantric path, coming from a very devout Hindu Vedic life. So I think you might find it interesting if you're looking for additional reading.
Who's the author?
The author is B. Bhattacharya, Bhattacharya.
Bhattacharya. Yes, it's a good book. And I want to thank Andrew for this amazing presentation, his generosity, and putting all this together and offering it to us. And I want to thank Arabella for organizing this, and I'm so glad that all of you came, and it's wonderful to see this happening.
Well, Ravi ji, you were like icing on the cake, so thank you for coming. We'll close with a chant, and it's a different chant, so I'm putting it up right now. So we'll begin again 3 breaths, and on the 3rd breath, Om. If you could all please mute. And 3 breaths. Purnamada, Purnamada, Purnamidam, Purnamidam, Purnat, Purnat, Purnamudachyate, Purnamudachyate, Purnasya, Purnasya, Purnamadaya, Purnamadaya, Purnamidam Purnameva Vashishyate. Purnameva Vashishyate. Together. Om Shanti. 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 If this is full and that is full, if we add fullness to the fullness, fullness remains. If we subtract fullness from the fullness, fullness remains. Peace, peace, peace. Thank you, Andrew. Our next Tuesday Tantra class is August 4th. Reach out to me if you are interested in attending. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Arabella.
Thank you, Arabella. Thanks,
Thank
Roger.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arabella.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you all. This was wonderful.